The fog hung thick over the Seine, swallowing the lights of the Night Ferry as it drifted toward the dock. It was a slow, ponderous thing, more barge than boat, carrying weary passengers across the river at an hour when only the lost or the restless travelled. The low hum of the engine barely disturbed the hush of the night. Inspector Jules Girard stood at the embankment, collar turned up against the damp chill, watching as the ferry bumped against the mooring. A thin-eyed dock worker secured the ropes, and the ramp clanked down. A handful of passengers disembarked, their footsteps lost in the heavy silence. But Girard's focus was on the crew member waving frantically from the deck. "Inspector."
"Over here!" Girard moved swiftly up the ramp, boots steady on the slick metal. He was led toward the upper deck, a space enclosed in glass where passengers could sit, sheltered from the cold. The door was locked from the inside. That was the
first oddity. The second was the body slumped over the table inside. Etienne Lemoine, a wealthy Parisian financier, sat as though he had merely dozed off, head resting against the window. His coat was neatly buttoned, his hat on the table beside a half-empty glass of wine. It would have looked peaceful were it not for the thin line of blood trickling from his temple. The crew had tried the door, but it would not budge. No one had seen anyone enter or leave. The only key was carried by the ferry's captain, who swore on his life that it had remained in his pocket all night. Girard signalled to the lock specialist accompanying him. With a few expert turns, the mechanism clicked open. The door swung inward, and the air inside was undisturbed. No smell of gunpowder, no overturned chairs, no sign of struggle. But the most confounding detail was on the table itself. Near the victim's wine glass sat a single playing card, the King of Hearts. It was crisp, unbent, as if it had been placed there deliberately, and it made no sense. Girard examined the corpse. No weapon, no bullet wound. The only mark was the thin gash at his temple, perhaps from a fall, but not deep enough to have killed him outright. He felt for a pulse out of habit. Cold. Rigour had not yet set in, suggesting the man had died within the last hour. The ferry's manifest showed 10 passengers that night, plus the crew. Most had already left the scene, save for 2, a middle-aged woman who had dozed off near the back, and a nervous young man who claimed to have seen nothing. Girard turned the playing card over in his hand, considering its presence. A gambler's warning? A cryptic signature? Or merely a coincidence? No, there were no coincidences in murder. The Night Ferry had been in motion the entire time. No one could have boarded or disembarked unnoticed. The killer had to be among those who had been on the boat. And yet, how had they done it? How had they escaped the locked room without a key? Girard took one last look at the lifeless figure of Etienne Lemoine and knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary murder. Girard turned the playing card over in his fingers, the edges smooth and unblemished. It wasn't tucked in a pocket or carelessly dropped. It had been placed with intention, a deliberate touch meant to be found. A signature, a message, or something else entirely. He slipped it into his coat and turned his attention to the scene once more. The authorities had begun their routine. 2 uniformed officers questioned the remaining passengers at the far end of the deck. Another examined the door's lock, shaking his head. The ferry's captain stood nearby, shifting uneasily from foot to foot. The man was in his 60s, with a wiry frame and a face weathered by years on the river.
"I told you, Inspector," the captain said, voice hoarse. "That door was locked the whole time. No one could have gone in or out." Girard studied him for a moment. "And you're certain the key never left your possession?" "Of course. I keep it here." The captain tapped a pocket on his coat. I checked as soon as we docked. Still there. A routine check confirmed it. His key was present and untouched. The only key. That should have made the crime impossible. Girard glanced
back at the victim. Etienne Lemoine remained slumped in his chair, untouched save for the lock specialist's careful examination. His glass of wine half drained, his coat neatly buttoned, his hat beside him. Everything in its place, everything except the playing card. The officers were questioning the two lingering passengers, but Girard preferred to watch before speaking. People revealed far more in silence than in words. The woman, mid-50s, conservatively dressed, hands clenched in her lap, shook her head firmly at the officer's question. "I was asleep," she said. "I told you, I was exhausted. I didn't see anything." The young man beside her, pale, thin, with dark eyes that flitted from the body to the door, shifted uncomfortably. I was on the lower deck," he said. "I only came up when we docked." Girard studied him, noting the tension in his hands, the way his fingers twitched as though resisting the urge to fidget. A nervous witness, or something more? He stepped closer, and the young man stiffened. "You took the ferry often?" Girard
asked casually. The man swallowed. Not really. Just tonight." Girard tilted his head. "And you were below deck the entire time?" "Yes." A pause, then Girard glanced at the woman. "And you, madame? Did you happen to notice this young man come up earlier?"
"Perhaps for air?" She blinked. "No, as I said, I was asleep." Girard nodded, filing the responses away. He turned back to the body. Something was missing, something small but wrong. The placement of the hat, the angle of the glass, the untouched pocket square in Lemoine's coat. And then he saw it. Lemoine's left sleeve, just at the cuff.
A slight smudge, nearly invisible in the dim light. Wine. A faint stain of red against the crisp white fabric. Yet his glass was still half full. No sign of a spill on the table. Girard's eyes flicked to the glass again. It had been placed carefully.
Before him, undisturbed. The wine hadn't been knocked, splashed, or spilled in any obvious way. So, how had it reached his sleeve? He turned abruptly to the lock specialist. "Check the handle again. Look for any residue." The man frowned but obeyed, running a gloved finger along the brass. A moment later, he held it up. A faint sheen, barely visible. Not dust. Something smoother. Oily. Girard's mind clicked into motion. The locked door. The untouched glass. The precise placement of the body. It was beginning to make sense. He turned back to the young man who had begun shifting from foot to foot. "Tell me," Girard said, voice even, "when did you last see Monsieur Lemoine?" The young man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The hesitation was brief, just a flicker of uncertainty in the young man's eyes, but Girard caught it. It was the kind of moment that separated the nervous from the guilty. He did not press immediately. Pressing too soon would make the boy clamp up. Instead, he let the silence stretch, watching the pressure work on him. I didn't see him," the young man finally stammered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Not really. I mean, I might have glanced up when I came aboard. But I wasn't paying attention." Girard nodded slowly, as if the answer were perfectly reasonable. "And when you came up to the deck, did you notice anything unusual?" The boy licked his lips. "No, just the body." "Just the body," Girard repeated. "And yet you claim you were on the lower deck all this time?" "Yes." The the young man said too quickly. Like I told you. Girard turned his attention to the woman, who was watching their exchange with her lips pressed into a tight line. And you, madame? You saw nothing? She shook her head, her hands still clasped together in her lap. I was asleep. All the way through? A pause. Then? Yes. Girard's gaze lingered on her for a moment. Her coat was thick, well-tailored, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to wealth, or at least a certain refinement. She was composed, but too still, as if carefully controlling. Every breath, every movement. And you know nothing of Monsieur Lemoine? Only what I read in the papers. A perfectly neutral answer. His name is well known, of course? Of course, Girard echoed. A successful financier, a man with many dealings, many connections. He let the words hang. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite fear, something smaller, buried deeper. A private thought she didn't want exposed. Girard turned away as if he had learned nothing, stepping back to the table where Lemoine's body remained undisturbed. The playing card still weighed in his pocket, its presence gnawing at him. He studied the scene again, searching for the small inconsistencies that made the difference between truth and deception. The glass of wine, the locked door, the smudge on the sleeve. He looked at the young man again. What is your name? Mark, the boy said, and you came aboard alone? Yes. You don't seem the type to take the night ferry often. Why tonight? Mark hesitated again, this time longer. Just needed to clear my head. In the middle of the night? In the cold? Girard's tone was light, almost conversational. Mark shrugged, avoiding his gaze.
I had things to think about. A non-answer. But Girard already knew that Mark was hiding something. Whether it was the murder itself or something adjacent, he wasn't sure yet. He turned back to the woman. And you, madame? A flicker of irritation crossed her face, as if she resented being questioned further. I was visiting my sister. I missed the last train and had no choice but to take the ferry. A frustrating inconvenience, I imagine. It was. There was no emotion behind her words, no elaboration. A woman with nothing to hide might have gone on about the cold, the fatigue, the discomfort of waiting. But she kept herself contained. Her answers clipped and efficient. Girard took a slow step closer. Tell me, madam, do you play cards? A strange question, one that made both the woman and Mark react in different ways. She barely blinked. No, but Mark twitched, just slightly. A reaction quickly swallowed. Girard let silence settle before speaking again. Someone left a calling card on the table, he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing the King of Hearts. He turned it over in his fingers, watching both of them closely. A strange choice, don't you think? The woman glanced at it briefly, uninterested. A gambler's habit, perhaps? Perhaps, Girard said. Or a message. This time, Mark didn't just shift, he outright flinched. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Girard smiled slightly. Tell me, Mark, do you gamble? Mark's jaw tensed. No. A lie. The woman, however, remained impassive, but Girard caught the faintest twitch in her fingers, the slight way she angled her body away from the table. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. You've seen this card before? He said to her. No. Another lie. 2 witnesses. 2 liars? But for entirely different reasons. The contradictions had begun. Now it was a matter of pulling the right thread.
Girard let the silence stretch, watching the weight of the King of Hearts settle over the two suspects. Lies had a way of shifting a room's atmosphere, subtle changes in breath, in the way people held themselves. Mark looked ready to flee, but the woman remained composed, her expression unreadable. They were both holding something back, but for different reasons. The trick was untangling which thread led to the truth. He turned the card over between his fingers again before slipping it back into his pocket. "Interesting," he murmured. "No gamblers here, no connection to Monsieur Lemoine, and yet this card finds its way to his table. Strange, wouldn't you say?" Mark glanced away. "I don't know anything about it."
"And yet you reacted when I mentioned cards." "I just—" Mark exhaled sharply. "I used to play, a long time ago, that's all." "Is that all?" Girard asked lightly. Mark hesitated again.
It was the same pause as before, that half-second of uncertainty that said more than words ever could. Girard watched as he weighed his next answer, debating how much to reveal. "I owed some money," Mark admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not much. Not to Lemoine, but to someone who knew him." Girard nodded, as if that was exactly what he had expected. "And who would that be?" Mark's mouth tightened. "I don't know his real name. I only know what people call him, Lebaron." The name flickered something in Girard's memory. A shadowy figure whispered about in gambling circles, a financier of sorts, but one whose interest rates were counted in broken bones rather than percentages. A man like that wouldn't care for half-hearted excuses. If Mark owed him money, he had every reason to be afraid. "Did you see Lemoine tonight?" Mark shook his head.
"No, I mean not before I saw him dead." Another evasion, but one Girard let slide. He turned back to the woman. "And you, madame, are you also acquainted with Lebaron?" Her expression didn't change, but her fingers clenched slightly.
"I do not keep company with criminals, Inspector." "Of course not," Girard said, "but you recognize the card." The woman didn't move, didn't blink. For a moment, Girard thought she might not answer at all. Then at last, she exhaled through her nose as if coming to a decision. "I've seen that card before," she admitted. "But not in the way you think." "Enlighten me." She reached into her handbag and withdrew something small, folding it neatly into her palm before extending it to Girard. When he took it, he realized it was a business card. Thick stock, embossed letters. Lemoine and Partners. Financial Consulting. He turned it over. On the back, written in tight slanted script, was a single phrase. "The king falls at midnight." Girard felt the weight of those words settle into place. Lemoine had known something, expected something, and now he was dead. "You were in contact with him," he said, more statement than question. The woman nodded. "I was supposed to meet him tomorrow. He said he had information that would change everything." "And what was that information?" "I don't know," she admitted. "He wouldn't say over the phone, only that it was dangerous." Girard studied her carefully. She was still holding something back. But the outline of the truth was starting to take shape. Mark owed money. The woman had a meeting scheduled, and Lemoine had left behind a warning, a clue embedded in a playing card. But who had wanted him dead, and why? The contradictions remained, but Girard was getting closer. The discovery of the note sent a ripple through the investigation. The officers, eager to close the case, seized on the simplest explanation. The words, "the king falls at midnight," suggested premeditation. And with Mark's gambling debts tying him to figures in the criminal underworld, It was enough to push him into the spotlight as the prime suspect. Gerard watched as the young man was hauled to his feet, his protests swallowed by the shuffle of heavy boots. One of the officers gripped his arm too tightly, as if expecting him to bolt. Mark's face had gone pale. "I didn't do anything." His voice cracked with desperation. "I told you, I never even spoke to Lemoine." "Then how do you explain this note?" The captain, who had been observing quietly until now, gestured to the business card. His voice was thick with certainty. "You owed money to dangerous people, and Lemoine was a man who knew too much. Maybe you saw your chance to solve both problems at once."
"That's insane," Mark struggled, his thin frame useless against the officer's grip. "I was below deck the whole time. Ask anyone. I couldn't have done it." Gerard sighed and ran a hand along his jaw. The scene played out predictably.
The authorities wanted an answer, any answer, and Mark was an easy target. The gambling debts, the nervous behavior, the evasions. It was enough to satisfy them, but not him. The crime was too precise. A locked room, a glass untouched, a body slumped as if sleep had simply overtaken him. And then there was the playing card, placed with deliberate intent. If Mark had been desperate enough to kill, the crime would have been messy, frantic. But this was something else. Gerard took a slow step forward, just as the officer began to lead Mark away. "Release him." His voice was calm but firm. The officer hesitated, glancing at the captain. "With all due respect, Inspector," the captain said, his patience thinning, "we have enough to hold him." "No, you don't." Gerard turned the business card over in his fingers. "Mark's debts may have put him in trouble, but he had no reason to kill Lemoine. If anything, he needed him alive." He flicked his gaze to the woman. "And Madame?" She had an appointment with the victim. If she intended to kill him, why not do it in private, where no one could witness her arrival? The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then who else? We have no other suspects." "Perhaps not a suspect," Gerard mused, "but a mistake, a detail we've overlooked." He walked back to the table where Lemoine sat, untouched since the investigation began. Carefully, he traced a gloved hand along the rim of the half-finished glass of wine. Then, as if on instinct, he dipped his fingers to the underside of the table. There it was, a faint, sticky residue, almost imperceptible, but enough for Gerard to recognize it for what it was. Sedative. The realization clicked into place. Lemoine
hadn't been killed in a struggle. He had been drugged, his wine laced with something potent enough to lull him into unconsciousness. But if that was the case, why had the killer left the glass unfinished? Because he never drank it. The answer
lay elsewhere. Gerard's eyes darted back to Lemoine's sleeve, where the smudge of wine remained, a single drop out of place. And suddenly he knew. Lemoine hadn't drunk from his glass at all. He had been drugged before he even sat down. The wine had been staged, an illusion meant to mislead, and that meant the real killer was still watching, waiting to see if their deception would hold. Gerard straightened, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. The case wasn't solved. In fact, it was just beginning. Gerard stood in the quiet hum of the ferry's cabin, his fingers lightly tapping against the business card. His mind ran through the details again, threading connections that had, until now, remained unseen. The captain and his men were still convinced they had their man, but Gerard knew better. The real culprit was still out there, watching, waiting for their deception to settle into permanence. The wine glass, the smudge on Lemoine's sleeve, the card, left behind like a signature, It was all too precise, too careful. Whoever had orchestrated this had planned every moment. And that meant they had experience, a professional, or someone who had done this before. He turned his attention back to Mark and the woman. Two people who should have had nothing to do with each other, yet their paths had converged here, on this
ferry, on this night. The more he thought about it, the more it felt wrong. Coincidences existed, but this was not one of them. Gerard reached into his coat and pulled out his cigarette case, tapping one against the silver lid before slipping
it between his lips. He didn't light it, he rarely did, but the motion helped him think. He turned to Mark first. "Tell me again about Lebaron." Mark swallowed. "I told you, he's just a name in the gambling circles. I don't know who he really is." "But you owed him money." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. How much?" "A few thousand francs," Gerard exhaled through his nose. "And yet you're still standing. Lebaron doesn't let debts linger. Either you pay or he makes an example of you." He studied the boy carefully. "So why are you still here, Mark?" Mark's jaw tensed. "I was supposed to pay him back this week." "And Lemoine? What does he have to do with it?" "I don't know." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "I never even spoke to him, but I heard things. People said he was in deep with some dangerous people, maybe even Lebaron himself." That caught Girard's interest. Lemoine was a financier, a man who dealt in money and risk. If he had dealings with Lebaron, then this was no longer just a simple murder. It was a war of debts, power, and silence. But that still didn't explain the woman. Gerard turned to her now, watching the way she held herself. Too still, too controlled. "Madame, you said you were supposed to meet Lemoine tomorrow?" "Yes." "And he claimed to have information that would change everything." She inclined her head slightly, neither confirming nor denying. Gerard let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Tell me something. Did Lemoine ever mention a case from 15 years ago?" Something flickered in her expression. A tiny crack in her composure, gone almost as soon as it appeared. But Gerard had seen it. He pressed on. "The Chumbury affair." This time she did react. It was small, a shift of her shoulders, but it was enough. Mark looked between them, confused. "What's that?" Gerard ignored him, keeping his eyes on the woman. "I remember it well. A scandal that nearly brought down several influential men. A banker was found dead in his study, gunshot to the head. Officially ruled a suicide, but there were whispers that it was something else." He tapped his cigarette against his palm. Lemoine was one of the people who benefited most when the case was closed. He acquired certain assets that should have gone to others. And now, all these years later, he winds up dead under similarly questionable circumstances. The woman's silence was louder than words. Gerard leaned in slightly. "What was your connection to Chumbury?" She exhaled slowly, as if making peace with something long buried. Then, at last, she spoke. "My husband," she said softly. "He was the one who died." Mark blinked. "Wait, you mean—" "Yes," she said. "And I never believed it was suicide." Gerard nodded, as if he had already known. "And Lemoine?" "What did he know?" She lifted her chin. "The truth." The room felt suddenly colder. The past was no longer just a distant shadow. It had bled into the present, twisting its way through debts, secrets, and murder. And now, Gerard realized, the real killer wasn't just covering their tracks. They were finishing what had started years ago. Girard let the revelation settle like dust in the dimly lit cabin. The Chambéry affair, 15 years buried but never forgotten. A suicide that he had never felt quite right. A scandal that had almost unraveled powerful men. And now Lemoine, a man who had profited from that case, lay dead under equally suspicious circumstances. It was no coincidence. The woman, still composed, sat with her hands folded, but Girard had seen the flicker of emotion in her eyes. This was personal. Mark shifted uncomfortably. So, what does this mean? Lemoine was killed because of something that happened 15 years ago? Girard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the King of Hearts once more, letting the card rest on his palm. He watched their reactions. The woman's gaze flicked toward it just for a second. Mark, however, swallowed hard, his fingers twitching like he wanted to reach out and touch it, but thought better of it. Girard exhaled through his nose, amused. "Strange, isn't it?" he said, turning the card over, running a finger along its edge. "How something so small, so seemingly insignificant, can carry such weight." He let his words hang before adding, "A gambler sees luck. A banker sees risk. A murderer sees a message." Mark paled. What are you saying?" Girard tilted his head slightly, studying him. "When I first found this, I assumed it was left by the killer. But what if it was left for the killer?" The
silence deepened.
The ferry creaked faintly as it swayed over the dark waters, the low hum of the engines filling the space between words. Girard tapped the card lightly against the wooden table. "You see, there's something peculiar about this. If Lemoine had found out something dangerous, if he had intended to reveal the truth about Chambéry, then why meet here on a night ferry of all places? Why leave a cryptic message on the back of his business card? And most importantly," he leaned forward, his voice lowering, "why leave a playing card behind?" Neither of them spoke. Girard smiled faintly. "Because it wasn't Lemoine who left it." Mark blinked. "Then who?" "The killer." The woman inhaled sharply, but Mark, he flinched. It was subtle, the kind of reaction a guilty man tries to suppress, but Girard had been watching closely. "Someone wanted us to believe that Lemoine's death was connected to gambling, that this was about money, about debts." He paused, watching Mark closely. "But what if it wasn't? What if it was about something much older?" Mark clenched his jaw. "That's ridiculous. Why would I—" "I never said you did anything," Girard interrupted smoothly, still watching him. "I merely said someone staged this crime to look like something it wasn't." He let the words linger. "But you reacted, Mark. And not just now."
Every time I've brought up the card or gambling or Lemoine's debts, you've shifted, hesitated, you've lied. Mark's nostrils flared. "I haven't." "You have," Girard cut in sharply. "But not about killing Lemoine, about—"
"Something else." Mark stiffened. Girard leaned back, his fingers drumming against the table. "Tell me, Mark, how does a small-time gambler drowning in debt end up in a first-class cabin on a ferry like this?" Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman's gaze snapped to him now, as if realizing the same thing. Girard smiled, slow and knowing. "Unless, of course, someone paid for your ticket." Mark's lips parted, but he still said,
"Nothing." The detective pressed on. "You claimed you never met Lemoine, that you had nothing to do with him. But what if you did? What if someone wanted you here tonight? Someone who knew you were desperate, who knew you were drowning in debt."
Girard's voice dropped lower, deliberate. Someone who wanted to use you. Mark's hands curled into fists on his lap. Gerard exhaled softly, flicking the card onto the table. It landed face up, the King of Hearts staring back. "Here's what I think," he said. "You weren't supposed to be the killer, Mark. You were supposed to be the suspect." Mark's breath hitched. The woman's eyes widened. Gerard's voice was almost gentle. "Someone set you up, Mark, and you walked right into it." The room fell into suffocating silence. And then Mark bolted. It was a poor attempt. Gerard was faster. He caught the young man by the collar, dragging him back down into the chair. Mark struggled, panting, but the fight was already gone from him. He wasn't trying to escape. He was panicking. "Why run?" Gerard asked, still holding him in place. "If you're innocent, why run?" Mark's head dropped, his breath shuddering. "Because He stopped, squeezing his eyes shut. "Because I did meet Lemoine." Gerard didn't let go. "Go on." Mark swallowed thickly. "I was supposed to deliver something to him." His hands shook. "A letter." The woman stiffened. "A letter?" Mark nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "From Lebaron." Gerard let go of him slowly, watching as Mark slumped in the chair. "What did it say?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't open it." He hesitated, then added, "But Lemoine did. And when he read it, he looked terrified." Gerard absorbed this carefully. A letter from Lebaron, a message that had shaken Lemoine to his core, and now he was dead. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about something still in motion. Gerard straightened, slipping the King of Hearts back into his pocket. They weren't hunting a murderer. They were hunting someone who was tying up loose ends. And the final knot had yet to be pulled. The ferry rocked gently against the current, the distant hum of the engine, the only sound filling the quiet cabin. Mark sat hunched over, his face pale and drawn, while the woman sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. Gerard stood between them, the weight of the revelation pressing against his mind. A letter from Lebaron, delivered to Lemoine before his death. The implications stretched wide and dark. Whatever Lemoine had learned, whatever had frightened him enough to arrange a secret meeting on a night ferry, it had sealed his fate. And now it was missing. Gerard reached into his coat pocket, feeling for the King of Hearts once more, letting the smooth edge of the card press against his fingertips. If the letter had been the final thread connecting Lemoine's murder to Chambéry, then whoever had orchestrated this had already anticipated its importance. He turned sharply to Mark. "Where is the letter now?" Mark blinked, his lips trembling slightly. I don't know. Lemoine had it when I left him. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. I swear I didn't." Gerard's chest tightened. "The jacket!" He strode toward the door without another word, his shoes pounding against the narrow hallway as he made his way back toward the storage room where Lemoine's body had been placed. The constable guarding the door looked up in surprise as Gerard brushed past him without explanation, stepping into the dim, cold room where the financier's lifeless form remained. The body was untouched, just as Gerard had last seen it. But the moment his gaze fell to Lemoine's jacket, draped neatly over the chair in the corner, a sharp unease settled in his stomach. He moved toward it, fingers running over the smooth fabric before slipping into the inside pocket. Empty. Gerard cursed under his breath, checking the other pockets with growing urgency. Nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a trace of the letter Mark had described. It was gone. Someone had taken it. A slow exhale left his lips as he straightened, his mind racing through the possibilities. The cabin had been locked. Only the authorities had access, which meant that the enemy wasn't just outside the investigation. They were within it. Girard turned on his heel and strode back out into the hall, his eyes scanning the faces of the officers moving about the ship. He caught sight of Captain Moreau speaking with Inspector Renault near the deck railing, their voices low and serious. As he approached, Moreau glanced up, his brow furrowing. "What is it, Girard?" the captain asked. "The letter," Girard said evenly. "It's missing," Renault's expression darkened. "Impossible. No one has touched the body since we moved it. Then how do you explain the fact that the one piece of evidence linking Lemoine to his murder has vanished?" Girard shot back. Moreau's lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you certain it was ever there?" Girard's patience thinned. "Mark saw him with it. Lemoine read it. He reacted to it. And now it's gone." Renault shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the officers gathered nearby. "If someone removed it, it wasn't any of my men." "Then who?" The weight of the question hung between them. The ferry was a closed environment. Only a handful of people had access to Lemoine's body after it was moved. If one of them had taken the letter, it meant someone among them was working to keep the truth buried. Girard let his gaze drift across the deck, his instincts sharpening. The killer wasn't done yet. They had staged Lemoine's death to send a message. They had planted the King of Hearts as a deliberate misdirection, and now they were erasing the final traces of the real motive. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for. Girard didn't need the letter to know the truth. He had already seen the fear in Lemoine's eyes through Mark's account. He had already connected the murder to the Chambéry affair. And now, by stealing the evidence, the killer had confirmed something else. They were still here. A slow smirk curled at the edge of Girard's lips as he stepped back, folding his hands behind his back. The letter was gone, but that was fine. Because whoever had taken it had just made their biggest mistake. They had revealed themselves. Now it was only a matter of drawing them into the light. The wind had picked up, whistling through the narrow corridors of the ferry as it cut through the dark waters. The mood among the passengers and crew had shifted, a taut unease settling over them. Girard could feel it in the way people avoided his gaze, in the murmurs that died when he walked past. The missing letter had rattled more than just him. It had shaken the illusion that this case was under control. He moved with measured steps, his mind turning over the facts. Someone had risked everything to take that letter. That meant it was more dangerous in the wrong hands than in his. But the thief had also made a fatal error. They had shown their hand. Girard was about to return to Mark when a sudden noise split through the air, a sharp, panicked scream. It came from above, near the upper deck. He reacted instantly, pushing past startled passengers and up the narrow staircase, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The deck was eerily empty, the wind whipping against his coat. And then he saw it. A man was slumped against the railing, his body half draped over the edge, as if he had been caught mid-struggle. Blood trickled down his temple, staining his shirt. For one brief moment, Girard's breath caught. Was it Mark? But no, the figure was broader, older. It was Captain Moreau. Girard rushed to his side, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. A pulse, faint but steady. He was alive, but someone had tried to silence him, a shuffle behind him. Girard spun just in time to catch a glimpse of a shadow disappearing down the far staircase. Without hesitation, he took off in pursuit, boots pounding against the wooden boards. He reached the lower deck just as the figure ducked into the cargo hold. The scent of damp wood and rusted metal filled the air as Girard followed, his body tense. The shadows shifted, the dim lantern light barely illuminating the stacked crates. He moved forward slowly, every muscle coiled in anticipation. Then, movement. A blur of motion as someone lunged at him from the darkness. Girard twisted just in time to avoid the blow, the glint of a knife flashing past his cheek. He struck back, his fist connecting with the attacker's arm. The knife clattered to the ground, but the assailant was fast, too fast. Before Girard could get a firm grip, they wrenched free, stumbling backward into the shadows. Girard lunged, but the figure was already gone, slipping through a side door and vanishing into the depths of the ship. Panting, he picked up the fallen knife, its handle slick with sweat. He turned it over in his hand, recognizing the distinctive engravings. This wasn't a weapon taken from the ship's kitchen or a hurriedly grabbed object of opportunity. This was personal. Girard tightened his grip. The villain wasn't just trying to cover their tracks anymore. They were growing desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. He turned back toward the staircase, his mind sharpening with renewed focus. Whoever had taken the letter had just escalated the game. And now it was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about stopping the next one. The ship rocked gently beneath Girard's feet as he climbed back onto the main deck, his pulse still hammering from the attack. His fingers curled around the stolen knife, its weight grounding him. The assailant had been fast, careful, and deliberate, yet their failure to silence him meant they were running out of time. The question was, why now? Why escalate when they had already erased the letter? Captain Moreau groaned beside the railing, beginning to stir. Girard knelt beside him, keeping his voice low. "Captain, can you hear me?" Moreau blinked, disoriented. Then his eyes widened, and he tried to sit up too quickly, wincing at the pain in his head.
Someone was behind me," he muttered. "I turned, but then—" He touched the sticky warmth on his temple. "They must have struck me from behind." "Did you see them?" Moreau shook his head, frustrated. "No, but I had just come from the cargo hold. I thought I heard something. When I looked inside, I saw someone moving between the crates." He exhaled sharply. "I was going to investigate, but then—" He gestured vaguely to his wound. Girard's mind whirred. The cargo hold. That was where his own attacker had fled. The sequence of events lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. The same person
who had stolen the letter was now tying up loose ends. He glanced around, scanning the deck. The night had swallowed up most of the passengers, leaving only the faint glow of lanterns reflecting off the dark waters. Somewhere out there, the killer was watching, waiting, but they had made a mistake. They had acted out of desperation, and in doing so they had left something behind. The knife. Girard turned it over again, examining the delicate engravings. At first glance it was an ordinary blade, but the more he looked, the more familiar. It seemed the etching along the handle was distinctive, almost ceremonial. Then it struck him. He had seen this pattern before, not on the ship, but in the files surrounding the Chambéry affair. A symbol, part of an old insignia, linked to an exclusive club of financiers and aristocrats. It had been on the stationery Lemoine once used. It had been on the wax seal of the last document he had signed before disappearing from the public eye. And now it was here, on a weapon used in an attempt to kill him. Girard's breath came slow and steady. The pattern was taking shape. Lemoine had been involved in something bigger than simple business dealings. He had known something dangerous enough that someone had silenced him. And now, whoever was behind this was willing to kill, again to keep it buried. He pushed himself to his feet, his eyes narrowing as the pieces clicked into place. The killer hadn't just been covering their tracks, they had been sending a message. The letter had been taken not to protect the secrets within, but to ensure Girard knew they had the power to manipulate every piece of the puzzle. But power bred arrogance, and arrogance made people careless. Girard exhaled, his mind sharpening with new clarity. The next move wasn't about catching the killer off guard. It was about making them believe they were still in control, right up until the moment they weren't. The ferry creaked as it cut. Through the dark waters, the faint hum of the engines vibrating through the wooden boards beneath Girard's feet. The night air had grown colder, and the hush that had settled over the ship felt almost unnatural. Somewhere, hidden among the passengers, the true culprit was waiting, watching, believing they still held the upper hand. Girard turned the knife over once more in his palm, tracing the delicate etching along its handle. That symbol, the insignia, he had seen before, was more than just a mark of status. It was a brand, a declaration of belonging to a secretive and powerful circle, one that Lemoine had once been a part of. The question now was, had Lemoine tried to escape from them, or had he known something so dangerous that they had no choice but to silence him? He exhaled, his breath misting in the night air. If the Chambéry affair had taught him anything, it was that men in positions of influence rarely acted out of simple greed. Their motivations ran deeper, driven by fears, by ambitions, by secrets they couldn't afford to let slip. A faint movement caught his eye near the deck's edge, a shadow shifting just beyond the lantern's reach. Girard turned sharply, his hand going to his coat pocket where his revolver rested, but before he could call out, the figure stepped forward into the dim light. It was Madeleine Lemoine. Her dark eyes met his, her face pale but composed. "You're getting close, aren't you?" she murmured. Girard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her carefully. She had been restrained throughout the investigation, her grief measured, her words careful. But now there was something different in her expression, something that hadn't been there before. "You knew," Girard said, his voice quiet but firm. "From the beginning, you knew why your husband was killed." She inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the shawl draped over her shoulders. "I suspected," she admitted, "but I was afraid. I thought if I stayed silent, if I played the grieving widow, they would leave me alone." She looked away, her gaze flickering toward the sea. "But they won't, will they?" Girard took a slow step closer. "Who are they, Madeleine?" Her lips pressed together, hesitating. Then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders slumped. "The Societe Noire," she whispered. "A powerful group of financiers, politicians, men who operate in the shadows. My husband was involved with them for years, but he wanted out." Girard's jaw tightened. He had suspected something of the sort, but hearing it, confirmed, sent a fresh wave of understanding through him. "He was trying to cut ties," Madeleine continued, her voice shaking slightly. "He said he had proof, documents that would expose everything. He wanted to go to the authorities to bring them down. He thought he could do it quietly, that they wouldn't suspect." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "But of course they—"
"Did, and they made sure he never had the chance." Girard's mind raced.
If Lemoine had been gathering evidence, then the stolen letter might not have been the only piece of damning information. "There's more, isn't there?" he asked. She hesitated again, then nodded. "Yes. Before he was killed, he hid something."
"I don't know what, but he told me that if anything happened to him, I should find a way to get it to someone I trust."
Her eyes flickered toward him. "That's why they tried to kill you, Inspector. They think you already have it." A slow realization settled over him. The attacks, the stolen evidence, the escalating violence, it wasn't just about covering up the murder. It was about eliminating anyone who might uncover what Lemoine had left behind. A sharp gust of wind sent a shudder through the ferry, but Girard barely noticed. His focus had narrowed, the pieces finally snapping into place. The murder wasn't just about silencing Lemoine, it was about erasing everything he had discovered. And that meant the real danger hadn't passed. It had only just begun. The ferry loomed in the darkness, its lanterns flickering as the sea lapped against its hull. Girard stood near the railing, his mind working at a feverish pace. The revelation of the Societe Noire had changed everything. Lemoine's murder was not a crime of passion or simple greed. It had been a calculated execution to bury a secret that could topple powerful men. And now those same forces believed Girard held the last remaining proof of their existence. They would come for him. He turned to Madeleine. "You said your husband hid something. Do you know where?" She hesitated, then glanced around nervously, before lowering her voice. "Not exactly, but I know where he kept his most important documents, his leather case. It never left his side. The night before he left for this journey, he hid something inside one of the compartments." Her eyes darkened. If they killed him to keep that case from being opened, then whatever was inside must be the key to everything. Girard exhaled sharply. The case. It had been among Lemoine's personal belongings, retrieved by the authorities and stored in the captain's quarters for safekeeping. If the Societe Noire's agent aboard the ship had not already destroyed it, then it might still hold the final piece of the puzzle. But retrieving it meant walking into the open, knowing full well that the killer was watching his every move. Plan began to form in his mind. "Go back to your cabin," he instructed Madeleine. "Lock the door. No matter what you hear, stay inside until I come for you." She hesitated, eyes full of fear. "You're going after them, aren't you?" Girard gave a small, grim smile. "No, I'm letting them come to me." He turned and strode toward the captain's quarters. Inside, the room was dimly lit by an oil lamp, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Girard's eyes immediately landed on the small, battered leather case resting on the desk. He moved quickly, unlatching it with steady hands. Papers, neatly folded, lined the inside, but there, tucked into a hidden compartment near the base, was something else. A sealed envelope, thick with documents. He pulled it free, his pulse quickening. Then he heard it, a single, deliberate footstep, just outside the door. Girard didn't turn. Instead, he spoke into the silence. "You've been very careful up until now," he said, his voice even. "But you made a mistake." There was a pause. Then a quiet chuckle. "I suppose I did." The voice was familiar. Smooth, practiced. Girard turned slowly, and there, standing just inside the doorway, was Alain Renault, the ship's purser. Dressed impeccably in his uniform, Renault looked entirely composed, save for the revolver he now held in one gloved hand. Girard's eyes flickered toward it. A .32 caliber Webley, he noted. Not standard issue for a ferry employee, but perfect for a discreet execution, Renault smiled. You've always been a sharp one, Inspector. Girard kept his posture relaxed, though his every nerve was taut. You were waiting for the right moment. I imagine you had hoped I wouldn't find this. He gestured to the envelope. Renault's smile didn't falter. And yet here we are. Girard tilted his head slightly. Let me guess. The Societe Noire recruited you long before this. Perhaps you were already one of their loyal men, ensuring their business remained undisturbed. Renault gave an elegant shrug. Loyalty is a matter of perspective. They reward those who serve them well. His gaze darkened. Lemoine forgot.
That? Girard felt the tension coil in the air. The next few seconds would decide everything. You killed him yourself, didn't you? Girard said, watching for any flicker of reaction. You lured him to the stern under the pretense of
a private meeting, maybe even pretended to be an ally, and when he let his guard down, Renault's grip on the revolver tightened. Enough, Inspector. Girard ignored the warning, taking a slow step forward. But you didn't just kill him. You took the letter, searched his belongings. You thought you had destroyed all the evidence. Renault exhaled sharply. I should have killed you the moment you stepped aboard this ferry. Girard smiled faintly. Yes, that was your real mistake. A sudden burst of movement. Girard lunged to the side as Renault fired. The shot rang out, splintering wood where Girard had been standing a moment before. He dove forward, slamming into Renault, knocking the gun from his grasp. The two men struggled, the cramped quarters making every movement desperate and brutal. Renault fought with the precision of someone trained to kill quickly, but Girard had spent years in the field, wrestling with men twice his size in the back streets of Paris. He twisted, using Renault's own weight against him, sending them both crashing into the desk. The revolver skidded across the floor. Renault scrambled for it, but Girard was faster. He snatched the weapon and leveled it at the purser, breathing hard. Renault froze, chest heaving. It's over, Girard said, voice like steel. For the first time, Renault's composure wavered. Even
if you kill me, he spat, you'll never bring them down. Girard exhaled slowly. That's where you're wrong. He raised the envelope between two fingers. This, he said, is all I need. The distant sound of footsteps echoed.
Down the corridor, the authorities were coming, and this time the Societe Noire would finally face the light. The ferry's deck was alive with commotion as uniformed officers surged forward, their boots echoing against the planks. Girard stepped back, still holding. The revolver steady as two gendarmes seized Alain Renault, forcing his arms behind his back. The purser didn't struggle. He merely exhaled, his lips curling into something close to amusement. You think you've won, Renault murmured, voice barely audible over the wind. Girard studied him for a moment before lowering the weapon. I know I have. He turned to the lead officer, Lieutenant Marchand. Secure him below deck and place guards at his door. This isn't over until we reach the shore. Marchand nodded, but Renault only laughed softly. You're still
missing something, Inspector. Girard ignored him.
He had what he needed. The letters from Lemoine's hidden compartment, damning records that exposed the Societe Noire's inner dealings. The shadowy organization had reached deep into France's political and financial circles, controlling events from behind the scenes for years. Lemoine had tried to betray them, and they had silenced him. But now their secrecy had been shattered. As the gendarmes dragged Renault away, Girard turned toward the cabin where Madeleine was waiting. He knocked twice. The door creaked open, and she emerged, eyes filled with unspoken questions. You have
it? She asked. He nodded. It's over. But even as he said it, a thin sliver of unease curled in his gut. Something still felt wrong. He glanced at the envelope in his hand. The weight of it, the feel of the paper. It was as he remembered.
But Renault's words echoed in his mind. "You're still missing something." Girard's instincts had never failed him before, and now they screamed at him that there was one last piece of the puzzle he hadn't seen. He turned sharply and strode back toward the captain's quarters, his pulse quickening. He unlatched the case once more, spreading out the contents, combing through each page. The financial records, the coded messages, everything pointed to the Societe Noire's operations. But what was missing? Then he saw it, a small, almost imperceptible gap in the stack of papers, as though something had been removed. His stomach turned cold. Someone had already been here before him. A sudden shout from outside snapped his attention away. The deck had erupted into chaos. Gendarme voices rising in alarm, passengers scattering. Girard moved swiftly, stepping into the open air just in time to see two men forcing their way toward the lifeboats. The first, unmistakable even in the dim light, was Captain Bellamy. The second, his breath caught.
Madeline. He barely had time to process it before Bellamy turned, catching sight of him. The captain's face twisted, his usual composed demeanor replaced with naked fury. Without hesitation, he pulled a small derringer from his coat and fired.
Girard dropped low as the shot rang out, splintering the railing behind him. He surged forward, ducking between fleeing passengers, closing the distance as Bellamy fired again. The bullet grazed his shoulder, hot pains searing through his flesh, but he didn't stop. He reached them just as Bellamy grabbed Madeline's wrist, dragging her toward the lifeboat's ropes. "No!" Girard bellowed. Madeline twisted free, her expression unreadable. In that instant, Girard saw everything clearly. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a player. The real player. Bellamy turned the gun on her. "You told me the inspector would be easy to fool," he snarled. "You said he wouldn't look at you twice." Madeline didn't flinch. "And he didn't," she replied coolly. The final piece clicked into place. She had orchestrated this from the beginning. She had led him to the documents, given him just enough truth to keep him chasing shadows while she and Bellamy worked in the background. Renault had been a pawn. Bellamy had been a tool. And Madeleine had been the mastermind. Girard raised his revolver, his mind whirling. If she had gone to such lengths, what was she protecting? She met his gaze, her expression shifting. And then, before anyone could react, she moved. In a single fluid motion, she wrenched the derringer from Bellamy's grip, turned it on him, and fired. Bellamy staggered, his mouth opening in a silent gasp before he collapsed. The deck went still. Girard didn't lower his gun. Madeline stood. Over Bellamy's lifeless body, the derringer still warm in her grip. Slowly, she turned to Girard, her eyes shining with something unreadable. "I had no choice," she whispered. Girard exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of everything crashing down at once. The Societe Noire had lost two of its key players tonight, but something told him Madeline had never been their servant. She had been their enemy, and now she had erased every loose end that could expose her true role in all of this. The gendarmes surged forward, weapons drawn. Madeline made no move to resist as they surrounded her. Girard held her gaze, searching for any trace of remorse. But she only smiled faintly. "You'll never prove it," she said softly. And deep down, Girard knew she was right. The air on the deck of the Night Ferry remained thick with tension, even as the gendarmes moved in, binding Madeline's wrists with swift efficiency. The passengers, huddled at a safe distance, whispered in hushed, disbelieving tones. The body of Captain Bellamy lay sprawled on the planks, his lifeless eyes staring up at the stars. Gerard holstered his revolver, though his hand lingered near it. He had seen many criminals in his time, calculating, ruthless, desperate. But Madeline was something else entirely. She stood poised, her expression unreadable, as though she had expected this outcome all along. Lieutenant Marchand approached, giving Gerard a cautious glance before addressing the gendarmes. "Take her below deck and keep her under constant watch." As they led her away, Madeline didn't resist. But as she passed Gerard, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "You were always so close, Inspector," she murmured. "Closer than you realized." Gerard watched her disappear below deck, his mind racing. Something was still off. He stepped toward Bellamy's body, kneeling beside it. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the wooden planks, but it was what lay near his fingers that caught Gerard's attention. A slip of folded paper barely visible. Carefully he pried it from the dead man's grasp and unfolded it. The handwriting was small and deliberate, and as Gerard read, a chill ran down his spine. "It's too late. By the time you read this, the real work has already begun." Bellamy hadn't been trying to escape, he had been trying to warn them. Gerard shot to his feet, eyes sweeping across the ferry. The Societe Noire wasn't done. This had never been about stopping a single crime. It had been about something much larger. He turned to Marchand. "Keep her secured. I need to search."
Her cabin. "Now?" Marchand hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Gerard moved swiftly through the corridors, his pulse hammering in his ears. He reached Madeline's cabin, pushing the door open, his gaze sweeping across the space. Everything
was in place, the carefully packed luggage, the untouched bed. Nothing appeared out of order. But then, near the small writing desk, he saw it. A telegram, half burned in an ashtray. He plucked it out, his fingers brushing away the soot, revealing only fragments of words. Arrived, ensure delay. Next phase, set, a slow realization settled.
Over him, Madeleine had never intended to escape. She had wanted to be caught. The truth hit him like a sudden gust of cold wind.
The letters he had recovered, the confessions he had extracted from Renault and Bellamy, they had all been allowed, carefully planted, carefully orchestrated. The real scheme was still unfolding, somewhere beyond this ferry, and Madeline had made sure he was here, focused on her, while it happened. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. He had been chasing a shadow. The true mastermind, whoever they were, was still out there. And whatever they had set in motion was already underway. He turned sharply, striding back toward the lower decks where Madeline was being held. He had to confront her, had to make her tell him what was coming. But as he reached the stairwell, a deafening boom shook the ferry, the floor vibrating beneath his feet. Somewhere in the distance, a column of smoke curled into the night sky. Madeline's final move had begun. The ferry lurched violently as the explosion roared in the distance, sending a tremor through the deck. Gerard grabbed the railing to steady himself, his mind racing. The timing had been too precise, too deliberate. Whatever had just happened was part of a greater plan, one he had been too slow to see. He turned and sprinted toward the lower decks where Madeline had been detained. The corridor was thick with smoke, and the gendarmes were shouting orders, trying to control the panic. He pushed through, his eyes scanning for her. The cell door was open. Gerard's pulse hammered as he stepped inside. The guard who had been stationed there was slumped against the wall, unconscious but breathing. The shackles that had bound Madeline to the bench lay discarded on the floor. She was gone. A slow, sinking realization settled over him. She had planned everything down to the last detail. The cryptic telegram, Bellamy's last words, the carefully planted evidence. It had all been a game, and he had played his part exactly as she intended. The explosion had been a distraction. He turned on his heel, pushing back through the smoke-filled corridors, reaching the main deck. His eyes swept the passengers, searching for a familiar face. Had she disguised herself? Was she already on a lifeboat? Had she jumped into the dark waters below? The ferry was still afloat, but the damage had been done. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from the coastline. Another ship, perhaps? A
warehouse? He couldn't be sure.
Whatever had been set into motion, it was bigger than just this one night. A movement caught his eye near the gangway. A solitary figure slipping into the shadows just as the first rescue boats arrived. He rushed forward, but by the time he reached the spot, there was nothing but the fading echo of footsteps. She had vanished. The gendarmes worked quickly to restore order. Survivors were accounted for. Witness statements were collected. But the air of certainty that had accompanied the arrest was gone. Gerard found himself standing at the railing, staring out at the dark horizon. The case had been solved, or at least a case had been solved. The culprit had been identified, a conspiracy had been exposed, and yet the real question remained: had he truly won? The ferry's bell rang once, signaling to the rescue boats. Somewhere in the distance, sirens
wailed.
The night moved on, indifferent to the secrets it carried. Then, just as Gerard turned to leave, his eyes caught something on the deck near his feet. A playing card, the Queen of Spades. He bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. On the back, a single line was scrawled in elegant, looping script. "Until next time, Inspector." A chill ran through him. He slipped the card into his coat pocket and exhaled slowly. He had no doubt. There would be a next time.